It is Friday, and we have a seminar. Yes, another one. Is it? No, oh, I gotta look way up there. I have to be a rock star, right? Know how to do these mics. I'm very pleased to present to you Stephen Dow. He's from the University of California, San Diego, so he's a neighbor down the street. But he just arrived there, just in January. Before that, he was at Carnegie Mellon for a number of years. He did a postdoc at Stanford with Scott Clemmer. He got his PhD at Georgia Tech, all great big places with HCI. It's really great. And then he got his undergraduate degree at the University of Iowa, not so much a big HCI place, in industrial engineering with a focus on computer science. But today he's going to talk to us about collective creativity. We're very happy to have Stephen Dow with us.
Is this actually, I guess it is, projecting, okay. So it's very weird to be in a room where I can make you guys get up and come closer, but I won't.
It's just the way we are.
It's just the way we are, okay. Anyway, I'm excited to be here, and this is the first time I've given this particular version of the talk, so I'm interested in hearing your perspectives. It's always a work in progress, so that's a theme actually in the work I do is it's very much about iteration and how you sort of bring design practices into research. And like Judy was saying, I was at Carnegie Mellon for about 4.5 years, so mostly what I'm talking about is the last sort of 4.5 years of our work at Carnegie Mellon, where I was in the HCI Institute. And I'm a system builder and a designer, and we certainly do research as well, but you'll see sort of a running theme in this work is about creating systems, designing and creating systems that we can use then to study how people interact. It's sort of creating new opportunities to study different types of interactions. So to start this talk, I want to start by dispelling the notion of the lone genius. So behind many invention, there's an untold story about collective innovation. Nikola Tesla was not the only scientist tinkering around with radio technology. He competed with Edison. And both of them had teams of people working with them to help them sort of move these inventions forward. Of course, they're the ones that get most of the credit for this work. These innovations are much more collaborative and institutional than the stories that get told. Same is true in art and culture. Avatar was not the sole creation of James Cameron. There are actually 3,000 plus people who worked on this film. And so there's many examples in art and science where groups of people come together to create something greater than any one person could. So we can dispel the notion of the lone genius, and I don't think any of us would ever think that James Cameron created this film alone. Obviously it was a collaborative effort with many different types of structures that came together to make the film. Any modern film is that way. But what's really interesting is thinking about the internet and how quickly people can come together at scale to create things. That really brings this question of how people come together to innovate into new light. So millions of people came together to create Wikipedia. On Galaxy Zoo, there's science fans who categorize millions of galaxies captured by the Hubble telescope. Folded is a good example where gamers have come to play a game, and they're actually coming up with protein folding sequences that could impact laboratory science. And these systems essentially have discovered clever ways to motivate small contributions from people in a way that comes together to provide value at scale. So the question that interests me is how can we harness this collective energy, creativity, intelligence to innovate on important problems facing society, such as planning for and responding to natural disasters, or dealing with electronic waste, or designing bespoke, customized solutions for people with disabilities. There are a myriad of problems, big and small, where if we can harness the sort of collective participation, I think we can do some really interesting things with this notion of collective innovation. So, to frame this potential, I'm going to start by telling a personal experience that led to a collaborative research project. Many of us can relate to this frustration of attending a multi-track conference only to find this, an overcrowded talk, people in the aisleway, unlike this talk, like a really packed talk with people spilling out in the hallways. This is actually taken at CHI a few years ago, which is a 16-track parallel track conference. And so there's a room down the hall with a much bigger, many more seats. The room could have been hosting this talk. And the organizers didn't do anything wrong, per se. They just didn't know ahead of time what was going to be popular and what people really wanted to see. So I get to observe the planning process for CHI. It was very interesting to see how the organizers did this. It was very tangible and collaborative. They had a big sheet of paper up on the wall, and then they used Post-it notes to kind of plan out the conference. And so it had many assets. It was very collaborative and sort of tangible, but it was very time consuming. It took several days to do this. And what they created was flawed in many ways. They captured no information about how papers related to each other outside of the sessions that they had designed. And so you can imagine down the line when they get an author telling them, we can't present on Monday. We have to be at this other place, we can't be there on Monday. Can you change my talk to another day? They have no real way of knowing what the ramifications of making a swap are going to be. And they have no information about what people wanted to see throughout the conference. And so I think it's a nice metaphor for a wicked problem, these interconnected problems where you come up with one solution, it's actually causing problems and some for other people. So what we did is we started thinking, well, instead of having a few conference chairs plan this entire event for everyone in the community, using only the information they have in their heads, what if we can engage all the various stakeholders in the planning process? So we can get the program committee who just decided what papers got into the conference to tell us some relative similarity between the different papers. We can then go to the authors and give them a list of papers and say, okay, which papers do you think would be appropriate in a session with your paper? We can post the accepted papers ahead of time before the conference and get the attendees to tell us what papers they'd like to see, as they're kind of perusing the menu of content. And all of that data can make its way back into this planning interface that we designed to allow the conference organizers to take into account all the input from the community. And then it does things where it would highlight where there are disagreements, where there are conflicting constraints that need to be resolved, and it will help propose intelligent swaps so it causes the least amount of damage in other parts of the schedule. And it turns out that having a process like this provides a nice petri dish for doing experimental research, and I have some couple of papers where we're behind the scenes, we're actually like manipulating different ways of, for example, clustering papers. We have different user interfaces that we compared. So just by going to this scale, we're able to use it as an experimental platform. Not going to have time to really go into those, but I think it's just a nice way to do research that's impactful, but also be able to do science work behind it. But essentially, we've transformed this messy paper-based process into a digital process, and it's not necessarily any less social. I guess people are sitting there looking at their laptops and sort of hunkered down, but it's still a very social thing where we have people in a room and we say, okay, everyone take out your laptops, and for 20 minutes we're just going to spend time working on this activity where they're just looking at a list of papers, reading the abstracts, maybe making some links, okay, that seems like that one, and it's done in such a distributed way that we can have people working on different parts of the overall corpus of papers, and we can kind of sew it together by the end of that. So you can find more out at projectkobe.com. We've had a big impact, I think. The software has been used for the last 3 or 4 CHI conferences. We used it a couple years for CSCW, and have been getting some interest outside of the CHI community in wanting to use this this technique, this approach. And for me, this is a great example of how we might harness the collective energy and creativity of a large group of people to innovate on a complex problem. The core hypothesis here is that we can develop strategies and technologies to engage diverse stakeholders in a problem-solving process that shapes the design outcome. And it's not that we're just throwing a bunch of people in the room together and seeing what comes out. You know, I do believe there's a good counter hypothesis that you can have too many cooks in the kitchen. But what the work is really focused on is how can we structure these interactions so that we're motivating people to participate. Part of that is keeping the interactions short, like just contribute a little bit of time, and then thinking about how to kind of move them through different types of work. Kobe was a great project, a great example of how we can discover the constraints and preferences of an entire community and surface those to help drive decision making. Another opportunity in this sort of collective innovation space is once you have a design, once you have an idea, put it out there and get feedback. And so this angle starts with the assertion that feedback is a limited resource. You only have so much time to get feedback from your instructor, from your peers. You know, when you're out there in the real world, you're always under some sort of time or money constraint. So how can we leverage, and how can we leverage social media or crowdsourcing to help give us feedback on the things that we designed? The intuition here is not only are we serving that limited resource of feedback and helping to produce feedback that people don't normally have available to them, but we're helping people connect with their actual stakeholders. So when you're designing something for real people, you eventually want to sell it or give it in some way, interact with those actual people. Crowdsourcing and social media is one route to sort of discovering who you're designing for and then use them to shape what you're creating. So we created this tool called CrowdKRIT. It's a tool for people who do visual design to get feedback on their posters, on their advertisements, something visual that they've created. And what it does is it allows the designer to post their design, and then it has, in the case of visual design, we've pre-authored a rubric based on principles of visual design. And it has pre-authored critique statements, things that people may want to say in critique of a visual design. And we provide annotation tools. You can mark different parts of the design. And a feedback provider can comment as much as they want. They can apply these pre-authored critique statements. They can write their own. They can modify the critique statements. And then the tool visualizes the accumulated feedback for the designer. And so the designer can see an overview, or they can click in to find out more details within these different categories that we created: layout, theme, typography. So we have this, again, it's the same sort of pattern. We have this software now, and we've used it. Hundreds of people have used it to get feedback. Probably thousands at this point have been feedback providers. And we're using them to kind of do this experimental research. Testing factors related to scale, how the structuring of the critique affects the feedback exchange, different social dynamics that are important when going up to social media and asking for feedback. One of the things that we learned very early was that increasing the number of feedback providers did seem to lead to a greater number of issues being identified. So you can see this is just one of our studies kind of looking at how if you add feedback providers, you're starting to identify more issues, more of the issues that experts would find when looking at a design. Of course, it does start to taper off at the end, so it's probably not going to be something that always gives you value as you increase the number of feedback providers. We also collected a lot of data on the benefits of these scaffolds, these pre-authored critique statements. So when you're going out to crowdsourcing, like to a Mechanical Turk type of platform or onto social media, and you're asking just a lot of different people what they think, they're not necessarily experts in design. They're going to tell you what they think, but they're not going to necessarily have the domain knowledge to help give you really meaningful critique. But the rubrics were intended to help scaffold that. And so we looked at this, we did this study where we actually found the rubrics helped novices give feedback on par with people who had more design experience. And this was in terms of how it was perceived by the designer, the person getting feedback. So they couldn't distinguish the feedback that came from an expert versus the feedback that came from a novice who had used the rubric to help scaffold them. So in another project, we were exploring different media for giving feedback. So one of the things I do a lot in my classes, I'll have students storyboard a design concept. So I teach classes on interaction design. And you're kind of moving through different media as you're moving through the design process. You quickly go from ideas and sketches to storyboards, then to maybe to prototypes. At this very early stage, when it's just an idea, it's just a simple idea that you want to communicate, you can storyboard that and put that in front of people and get a lot of great feedback on whether there's a valid direction to go. And so we experimented with this online speed dating. It's a technique that Scott Davidoff, I don't know if you know Scott Davidoff at all, he was a CMU grad, now is at JPL, came up with this idea of speed dating, basically showing people like a dozen concepts back to back and getting their impressions of this. Great way to get early stage feedback. And we did this in an online setting where people gave video-based feedback. So they would look at your storyboards and then record a short video of themselves, you know, telling you what you think. And so really getting this rich interaction. Another thing we're doing in my classroom is I teach this class on interaction design startup. And what we do after we've sort of gotten to this idea, the students think they have a good idea, they've gone through that speed dating process where they've tested out some of their early concepts, they pick one that they really like. And so, okay, the next thing you do, let's create a homepage for your concept. You haven't developed your user interface yet, you certainly haven't programmed anything, you don't even have a UI sketch. Let's just create a homepage for your design concept. And maybe there's like an A version and a B version, so you're kind of maybe testing different value propositions or different phrasings or different visual designs. Let's put that up there on a website, and then we give our students a budget for advertising their concepts. So they go up onto Google AdWords and they create an ad, and then they advertise their homepage for their app. And the nice thing is that it gives students an opportunity to make data-driven choices about where they're going with their concept. It gives them confidence because all of a sudden, like, people are clicking, they're showing that there's interest in their ad, and then this actually worked. Like hundreds of people clicking on this ad, and then going to this homepage for an app that doesn't yet exist. And then they can look and see, okay, one of their versions seem to have more success than the other. They can kind of make choices. They're learning, not only design skills but data skills, social media, things that I think help set them apart when they go out into the job market. And again, it's about discovering the potential user base. So one of the clever things one of my student teams did was they had a section on their homepage that said, if you're interested in finding out more about this app, this is coming out in a few months. If you want to learn more, provide your email address. And so all the ethical considerations aside, the cool thing is they could grab those email addresses and then email them later when they have an UI prototype, or eventually if they did go out and create the app, they'd have the start of their core users, their really energized group of people who want to take that idea and run with it. So we made some great progress on this topic of feedback. There's still a lot to learn. How can we support the designer to interpret all the diverse feedback they're getting? So in that CrowdKRIT tool, they get feedback from, depending on how much effort you put into advertising your feedback request, how much money you put into crowdsourcing to get feedback providers, you can get quite a few feedback providers, and the information's often conflicting. So how can we support the interpretation of feedback what things to ignore, how to deal when there's conflicting information coming from people. There's interesting questions about social capital. So if you're going up to your social media network, or if you're requesting feedback from a special interest community, so I talked to a number of people today that do work in like health communities, and you want to design something for people who have diabetes or some other particular health issue, and you've been in communication with that special interest community, you may not want to go to them with every single design, every single like step in your design process, because then you'd quickly tap out. You'd expend all your social capital right away. So I think there's interesting strategies for how you go and sort of engage your communities of interest to engage in what is essentially like a large-scale participatory design process. So I'm going to kind of take a step back at this moment because I think our work is very much grounded in design theory. And one of my favorite models of the design process is really popularized by Bill Buxton, but came from earlier thinkers, actually architects, who represented the design process as a series of flare and focus, so diverging and converging modes of thinking as you're kind of thinking through a design space, eventually converging in on a solution that seems to best serve the need. But you actually have to propose ideas, in a sense, see what the world tells you, and then converge in on ones that seem most promising, build them out even more, higher fidelity, and then repeat, rinse and repeat. And so I realized somewhere along the line that what we've been working on essentially is looking at how to scale up this process at different stages, and how to engage more people in this process. So Kobe was very much about discovering the range of constraints and preferences that people have to help frame a problem. It's very much about surfacing all the tacit, hidden information within a community so that the people who are designing the experience can make a better decision. With crowd feedback, it's more about converging. You have ideas. Ideally, you have more than one. and then you're trying to make a choice. And so we can flare again, and we can ask, well, can we leverage scalable networks, crowds, social media to generate and explore solutions in parallel? And so there's quite a few collaborative ideation platforms. OpenIDEO is one of the better known ones, which is a platform that's started from out of the Bay Area. There's a design firm called IDEO. Do you guys know IDEO? Quite a few, yeah. So they have OpenIDEO. Climate Collab, we were talking about that this morning. There's another one of these. Let's get a lot of people to generate ideas. Budgetary, participatory budgeting has become a thing. Great idea. Let's get people to give us ideas that could affect how we spend the budget in a particular institution or a city. City of Cambridge tried this. Most of these systems succeed at that. They succeed at getting a fairly large number of diverse ideas. The key challenge is that many people tend to generate redundant and mundane ideas. Ideas that are not very good or repeat what somebody else has said. And part of the issue is that when you give people the whole list of ideas to look at, they come up there, they start reading other people's ideas, those ideas are going to influence their thinking. And so instead of exposing everyone to everyone else's ideas, are there smarter ways to do it? So my postdoc, Joel Chan, took this as a challenge. Simply exposing people to others' ideas may just lead to more mundane and redundant ideas. So we created this system that coordinates people to generate ideas in parallel. So we can bring people in and they're just going to be in their own world and generating ideas. But then we provide a visual dashboard where an expert is sort of monitoring all the ideas coming in. And it's going to visualize the ideas. And the expert could then use their wisdom and their intuition to provide inspiration back to the community of people generating ideas. So these might be selecting ideas that are particularly good. It might be schematizing something that came out. It may be some particular solution path that seems promising. They can write those up and deliver them back. And we found that that actually did indeed lead to more creativity, more creative ideas. And Joelle is going to be presenting this next week if anyone's going to CSCW. And this is great for on the order of tens of ideators. But what if we have 1,000 people generating ideas? I've been working with Christoph Gaius and his student Pau at Harvard University to come up with ways to more automatically deliver inspiration at scale. And one of the things we want to be able to do is, if you have thousands of ideas in a pool, how can we pick out the ones that are diverse and interesting, potentially valuable, and deliver those up to other people to inspire them to come up with more diverse ideas? In order to do that, we need some domain-independent and scalable method for modeling the semantic relationship between ideas. The semantics would help in terms of allowing us to sample the space so that we actually get diverse ideas. And automated text methods, text analysis, they could play a role. We certainly have explored those. But it turns out that a lot of times people come up with ideas are very short, like a few words. A lot of times ideas are generated, they don't have no text at all. It's a sketch or something like that. So we wanted a way to get the semantic relationships without having to rely on automated methods. And so the solution, of course, is to get humans to help judge. Just like in the COBE project, we were looking at the semantic relationships between things. Humans were kind of making assessments and providing metadata for how things relate. But the challenge here was how might we redesign idea generation so that people generate ideas, but they also contribute to this sort of judgment of similarity, or the semantic relationships among ideas. Essentially, how do we create like this giant affinity diagramming exercise? Have you guys ever done affinity diagramming, like with qualitative data? I'm sure that's very common at UC Irvine. Can we digitize that? Can we distribute that? How do we manage that? And how do we keep it interesting for people? The idea generation part is the fun part. Everyone wants to contribute their ideas and be creative, but when it comes to like reading others' ideas and like being analytical and critical, it's not as fun. So we prototyped a system where people generate ideas and organize them on a plane. And at any point, I had a pointer, it doesn't matter. At any point, you can ask for ideas of others. And it's going to go to some pool and pull in ideas for inspiration. You're not only generating ideas and they kind of populate the space, you're organizing your ideas with respect to each other, and you're pulling these inspirational examples up and organizing those as well. So everyone kind of has their own personal space, and there's a bunch of people that are doing this in parallel. And then as they're doing this, as they're generating ideas and organizing them, we're, in the background, we're collecting information based on how they've organized their plane and bringing that all together. And we actually use the T-S-N-E method by Van der Matten. Do you guys know him? He created the T distributed stochastic neighbor embedding. Basically what it's doing is it's taking a sparse matrix, affinity matrix, where it has some information about how all ideas relate to how all other ideas, and then it's creating a two-dimensional, low-dimensional representation of how those ideas interact. So it's essentially putting like ideas near each other. And then when we want to give people diverse samples, when they ask for ideas from others, we can diversely sample the space. And the idea here is that we can create this sort of virtuous loop where people ask for inspiration, we can diversify the sample of ideas that we give them, and then their subsequent work on organizing their local set of ideas will help make the idea map even richer and better. And the preliminary experiments show promise. When the system gives people automatically selected diverse examples, compared to getting no examples or compared to getting sort of examples with low diversity, so those that are sampled in a very local region of the idea map, they generated more diverse ideas. So diverse examples produced more diverse ideas, but maybe people just copied the examples, right? Maybe they just they became diverse because they're just simply like repeating something they saw in the examples they saw. And because the examples were diverse, hence their generated ideas were diverse. But we did a follow-up and we looked at that. It's not what happened. Actually, not only were their ideas more diverse, but they were also different from the examples that we gave them. So there's something in the composition and the diversity of the inspirations we were providing that allowed them to be sort of take it in new directions. You have a question?
I'm just not clear on what you mean by diversity of ideas. I mean, is there a metric you're using of some way?
Yes. So
Can you give examples?
There's two concepts that often get confused. One of them is in a idea map, how diverse in the space. So are you sampling from all over, or are you sampling from the
So
local?
is that a spatial metric you're using?
It is in this sense because we've reduced it down to a spatial representation. But it's multidimensional. It's actually multidimensional, and we're reducing it down to like a 2D spatial relationship.
Could you give me an example, please? Take two ideas that you think are diverse, or less diverse versus more diverse.
See, this is where I wish I had put a little more detail into this talk, because the actual experiment behind this was coming up with taglines for a birthday card. Okay, so creative idea generation task, something you would see in like a greeting card, and we gave them a prompt for coming up with a birthday message. Some of them had to do with the particular object of the birthday message was design a birthday card for a 50-year-old firefighter, female firefighter. And so some of them picked on the age, some of the ideas picked on the fact that she was a firefighter. You know, they played on those themes in different ways. And so a diverse sample would pick from multiple themes of that design space. It might take one that has to do with like blowing out candles, and you know the fact that she's a firefighter can help with that. There might be one that has to do with her age, and so just simply providing diversity in the kind of angles you could think about the problem is the goal there.
So is this like a semantic difference of the meaning of the words utilized?
Yeah, but I think at a more not simply the unit of analysis is less at like the word level and more at like what direction were they thinking? Like what are the conceptual solution paths that they are thinking about? That's the goal of trying to get people to kind of expand out of their local way of thinking.
I'm going to try to help a little bit.
Yeah, please.
My understanding is that this idea map is based on pulling together lots of individual idea maps that people are generating themselves. So in some sense, it's empirical design. People are making these maps on their own, and then you're rolling up all these individual maps to create this aggregated map, and it's based on what they did in their local maps. And so they have in their maps some sense of diversity, and then you're kind of collating that to make a kind of community diversity. But it's all empirical.
It's all empirical in the sense that humans are deciding how similar things are. It's all relative distancing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an interesting idea, and I appreciate what you're trying to do. I'm just trying to get clarity, because there are, of course, many other techniques you know, from in software development, we have, you know, collective requirements engineering, which does something quite similar. You have brainstorming, you have concept maps. I'm trying to understand what's new and different here, or is it just you don't know those other things and thus you don't know?
We know those other
kind of
things. We know those other things. I think what's unique here is that we can, we want to take advantage of human interpretation, which I think when you rely entirely on text, again, like I mentioned before, there's certain like types of idea generation where it's not going to be text-based. So we wanted to make sure it was independent of automated methods to some extent, and more reliant on human interpretation, which does make, you know, there's some noise in how people interpret things, obviously, but it doesn't make as much of the stupid mistakes where one word could be totally misinterpreted as something else. And so we wanted this method to be to rely on human interpretation. And then the clever thing, I think, is that we integrated the secondary task of doing the interpretation within the primary task of generating ideas. It's the same task, but we're just subtly adding this other thing where you have a plane and you're able to organize your ideas in the plane, which actually turns out to be somewhat helpful for idea generation in itself, and has the secondary benefit of generating this metadata about the semantic relationships. Even if we're not pinpointing exactly what those semantic relationships are, they're kind of emerging just from the subtle interactions people do. And it's sort of that extra work that they're doing is providing value to the entire community by allowing us to give people more inspirational examples when they ask for them. And so I think that's the contribution, is just sort of how we can improve ideation at scale by sort of subtly integrating this additional activity. It's sort of a new pattern for ideation that does actually improve outcomes. So it's a fun angle. I think we're just getting started on this. We have some grand plans that we just wrote up in a proposal that look at the next step is sort of thinking about how to subdivide a problem into sub-problems and then kind of exploring the many facets of a problem. So these three projects kind of get at different angles on collective innovation, from discovering the preferences and sort of constraints that can affect what you design in the first place, to getting large-scale feedback that's going to further shape your ideas, to generating lots of ideas. And all of these, I think, are not just do it, but how do you do it, and how do you do it in a way that's sustainable, that keeps people motivated. Then we have a bunch of other projects in this space. I'm just going to briefly run over a couple of them as I have time. So another opportunity, I think, is just in terms of all the information that's out there. So again, going back to a sort of affinity diagramming exercise, I became fascinated with this question of, like, when you have literally, in some cases, you know, when some problems are so complex, you have, you know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of disparate pieces of information that could affect how you end up thinking about a problem. And so can we take that raw information and distribute it to different people, have them interpret that, essentially cluster, make sense of information locally for part of the data, and a bunch of people are doing that. And it's all in terms of like very qualitative human interpretations, and then start to piece it together with other people's interpretations. And we had some success with that, yeah.
I'm just wondering about quality.
Yeah.
Where's the proof?
Where's the proof in any qualitative assessment?
Right.
That's the real challenge. There's no right or wrong,
A lot
to
of
some
this seems
extent.
like monkeys on a keyboard creating Shakespeare eventually. And so I'm still waiting to like see like, well, this is the great product or the great thing that we've designed using these techniques.
Yep.
And so I'm waiting, but I mean, this is really good so far.
Yeah, I mean, I could show you some of the things that have received feedback. I could show you what a schedule looks like when it's been crowd affected. even that, I mean, it's hard to know, like, is that schedule better than that schedule? Some of it is just, the biggest proof I think with the scheduling thing is it actually saved time. Like at an order of magnitude, much less time spent dealing with all the little issues. That's one thing we can definitely point to. But is the schedule better? Hopefully. At the very least, we've engaged the community in a way that helps them feel like they participated in the process, and I think that has a lot of value. Does the quality? You know, we had assessments for this. You know, and we were looking at particular factors. So this is where it gets into like an experimental thing. But how much context? How many bits of data? How was the data represented? Were all things that we could kind of play around with to see if this is an effective method. And then we had a baseline measure. We had an expert do their own qualitative assessment of the data, and we use that as sort of a way of assessing how close do the crowd's interpretations match the experts' interpretations. But yeah, the output isn't as pretty as you would want it to be. But it's just this idea of how can we distribute interpretation tasks to a large group of people. We also explored this with video data, so we have a system for doing video analysis by crowd, where it essentially takes a video, makes segments out of the video, and then it allows the person who wants to code that video to post tasks or questions that they want people to look for in the video. So these are things like gesture analysis or emotional analysis, things that are currently difficult for computer vision to do, certainly difficult given the wide context of where videos might show up, or if the video camera is moving or whatnot. We can get a crowd to do that, and then we can look at how much agreement there is, and then there might be places where the person wants to go in and further, more deeply code things. So they might look for all segments of video where a gesture happens, any gesture. And then within all the segments that have a gesture, then we can start to code different categories of gesture. So the idea was that a behavioral video coder, a behavioral scientist could actually interact with this at a rate where they could be developing their coding scheme in interaction with what the crowd is interpreting back. And they can speed up the loop for that. And so this is a very early project. It's a software prototype, and we're looking for opportunities actually if you have video data. We also looked at identity, so we want to be able to obscure the identity of people in the video, but still be able to do meaningful coding. Sort of shifting from online crowds into an in-person crowd. This is also in the space of feedback. My student Amy Shannon is exploring a tool for doing in-class feedback. And really what started this was the realization that in any modern classroom, everyone has some sort of device on them. How many people in this room are currently not carrying any sort of like cell phone, or you have a piece of paper? Wow. No cell phone, nothing? Wow.
Is it just you and me? Is it just you and me?
Just old school. So given that everyone has some sort of device, how hard would it be to like create these experiences where it's like, okay, let's go to this URL, short URL, everyone pull up the browser window and do some activity together. And in a classroom setting, there's lots of opportunities for engaging students in that way. The simple one, the sort of low-hanging fruit was right after a student team presents their work, everyone go and provide feedback for 5 minutes. And it works pretty great. So I think there's an interesting potential for taking advantage of a captive audience to contribute in ways that support discussion and future learning. Another project, I'm just going to really briefly mention this one, is about how to support decisions among a group of people. So if we have ever-increasing numbers of people that need to make a decision together, how do you do that? So if there's some way to, like if you're making a comparative decision in this case, is there a way to highlight where there are disagreements in how you think about the decision and use that to focus the discussion of a group? So you can see like the theme of the research has been to investigate what motivates people to participate in various forms of collective innovation, and then to design social technology to help coordinate these efforts, to then do empirical research on what are the factors affecting different forms of sort of collective decision-making and sort of creativity. I've come to understand different notions of collective, from physical existing communities of people to social media to crowdsourcing, where you can just ask for input from a lot of people on the push of a button. I'm interested in this notion of leveraging a community of people and their devices, potentially in the same physical space, and has interesting implications for how people unite, both virtually and physically, and engage in problem solving. And it allows for different channels for coordinating that activity, so someone can be showing something at the front of the classroom and everyone's working on a different task at their own device, and it's getting sort of brought together in a way and coordinated. And I'm into this idea that you can extend individual cognition at the push of a button. Another reason why I'm really excited to be at San Diego now in a cognitive science department, where they think about how people behave and think and make meaning, and some of the earliest theories that are kind of behind this work in distributed cognition and body cognition were invented there by some of the great people there. So that's pretty much the end of the talk. Thank you. I just want to acknowledge that this was very much a collective effort, and if you want to collaborate, I'm very open to it, as you can see. So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
We got a dead mic, so I'll just predict. We have time for some questions. I'm going to start with one. You say all these people are contributing, but what motivates them to contribute, and how does that select the right people to collaborate, or how do you get the right people to be helping out?
Well, I think the answer has got to be it depends.
Well, give us some examples then.
So in Kobe, that first project with the
Yeah.
scheduling, what motivates people to participate? Well, it depends on the stage, for one. I think in the case of the program committee, they had just spent 48 hours discussing the papers and deciding what papers get in and what don't. They have a lot of this information right here in their head, and we're asking for 20 minutes of time. And you're already on your laptop. It was such an easy transition into, okay, now do this other task where
It's
you're
a
kind of-
time-saving one, that one for them personally.
They're-
And they've got stuff in their
They're
head.
not going to do that. Usually it's the organizers who have to do that, saving time for them. But it's a small ask.
Yeah.
I think in the case of the authors are curious what other papers got in. What other papers might be like my paper.
Yeah.
And so that there's I want to go in, and they're motivated to figure out what papers to put in with their paper in their session. They want to have some say on that.
Right.
And so I think there's intrinsic motivators built in. And then it kind of builds on it. Each step of the process kind of builds on the previous. So we needed the preliminary affinities in order to get the top 10 list of papers for the authors. And then, and then when we go into the attendee sourcing, when we have that ability to select what papers we like to see at the conference, that's immediately leveraging the earlier affinity information by giving you suggestions. There's no cold start problem.
Right.
We already have data about how papers relate, so it's more than about, it's reaffirming it in some sense as we see what papers people like, but we can immediately give them good suggestions because the earlier stages of the process has worked. And so again, there's incentives there because you're not just saying what you like for the purpose of planning, you're saying what you like to make your own list and to get those recommendations about what else you might like.
But in all your subsequent experiments or systems, each one you have to think carefully about
Yes.
who would actually do this,
Right.
and what's their benefit, and therefore who am I getting to do it? It's not just anybody off the street.
That's
It's
right.
people who are motivated. I mean, like the Climate Collab. It's interesting to find out who are these people, and therefore what's the basis of their decision making.
Yes, and that, I think that with Climate CoLab, I know Tom well, and I think what's interesting there is you have a lot of people that are really interested in saving the planet, and they want to come and contribute their ideas. What we're realizing is that it's not just about generating ideas. You have all these like little, more mundane, more analytical tasks where if you get people to like look at, here are 20 ideas, cluster them, or here's 3 ideas, throw the odd man out. You know, some of these little micro tasks that are not as fun as generating ideas, or you don't get as much credit perhaps for doing them. The design, the cleverness comes into figuring out how to get those done and still get them engaged. So when you get them in there and engaged in doing the tasks that they like to do, how can we sneak in these little things that are more mundane? And that's where that idea came in, to kind of build in the plane that they're organizing ideas around. And but there's experimental work, like how do you interleave boring tasks with fun tasks? How often can you do that?
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
So indeed, our mic is dead, so yes, back there,
Yeah.
and say it really loud.
I'm loud, it's easy. Are you familiar with Usability Hub?
Is that one of those crowd sites for getting people to test usability on your thing?
Yeah, it's a crowdsourced UI/UX platform.
Yep.
And it works really quite well. And what you find is that other people that are involved in UI/UX are actually coming in to do the tests. And most of the tasks there's a lot of 5-second tasks. So they're very short duration. And they have a system where you actually get karma points, is what they call them, which allow you to run your own test for each test that you test. So they have a
They have a
self-building
system, right.
community,
Mm-hmm.
which might be something interesting for you to take a look at.
Yeah, we've looked at those. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. There's a lot of those types of things. I guess, very good. I think what's interesting from a science perspective is then trying to understand how to do it better, or what's actually going on behind the scenes that make it work. So there might be, if I actually had that system under my purview, you'd want to then test different mechanisms, maybe test the different point systems that they put in place.
They have different structures of tests that you can run. So they have a 5-second visualization test on the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're, obviously if you're a member, it unlocks additional features that you can't do on the free version.
Mm-hmm.
But and then they have a click-through test, and they also do heat mapping on what the person's doing with their cursor.
Yeah.
So it's some very interesting usability tests, but their system for engaging the community actually works quite well.
I agree. And there's enough professional tools out there for the higher end UI testing that I tend to stick more in the early stages of design, whether it's storyboarding or idea generation, or just getting qualitative feedback on something that's not really yet interactive. It's just like a sketch of something that's going to be built. But yeah, really cool stuff. Yeah.
On that note, is there a particular impetus that you have to move these activities online? Because I kind of like the tangible aspect of moving
Yeah.
things around and being like, hey, that's cool.
Yeah.
And I like that interaction. So what?
And I don't necessarily want to take that away. I think the impetus for it, partly it's opportunistic. Not many people have explored how social computing and design intersect, and thinking like, okay, well, design problems are getting more complex, and there are these efforts going on, like these collaborative innovation platforms, OpenIDEO, where they try to engage like large groups of people online. And so I think that's how the research ended up going there. But I don't necessarily want to take away the tangible stuff. In my class, it's all very, very physical. We do affinity diagramming on paper, but we introduce things that I think are valuable. I think the crowd feedback has been super useful. Partly because it gets people to realize there's lots of complexity in what people think and how people react to designs. And there's that whole issue of discovering who you're actually designing for, who it resonates with and who it doesn't resonate with. And so I think I'm not necessarily trying to push it that way. I think it's not always going to work better. I think it's a matter of that's where the science comes in. Sometimes it works better in that, and sometimes it works better in this way. So the affinity diagramming thing, maybe there's some hybrid way of doing it. Because after you do the physical affinity diagramming, you still need to like then go back and like write down how everything relates in order to do whatever you do with it next.
Time for one more? Walt already had his earlier. Gary? Gary?
No.
Gary already had his.
Gary had a question too. That's okay.
Is there somebody else who wants to?
I saw
Anybody else wanna go?
one more hand back there. Yeah,
We'll have you both.
I'm going to dinner with him, so.
That's good.
So you had this statement up earlier that said that you were basically aiming for a domain-independent and scalable method for modeling semantic relationships amongst ideas. But most of the successful examples that you showed were actually quite domain-specific. Do you have thoughts on how you're going to negotiate this granularity, the specificity?
Well, we demonstrated in one domain.
Hmm.
And there's no reason to believe that the method won't work in another domain. We have to test that to really understand it. And we've been piloting it in other domains, other problems, and I think to the extent that it is domain independent, I think to the extent that it works in multiple domains, I think it's an existence proof that it is domain independent. Does it work in all domains? Maybe not. Probably not. You know, I'm not claiming some sort of like universal solution here. So.
I actually like the domain specificity of the examples. I was just trying to figure out how
Yeah.
you would move, how you go from here to getting something that is then more domain independent.
Like I said, I think it's designed in a way to be domain independent. To really understand if it is, we'd have to continue trying it in many domains.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good answer. All right, thank you very much. Thanks.